The world's a mess. There are civil wars, proxy wars, and wars between nations. Insecurity plus poverty are driving mass migration of peoples. National security forces and public services are strained to respond. The world economy remains jittery. Political life is in turmoil, with the rapid turnover of leaders, factional infighting, and low confidence in the state. Meanwhile, on the domestic front, marriage and family are in crisis and neighbourhood loyalties in decline. Christians are subtly persecuted or openly martyred. Some commentators decry the collapse of traditional religion and values. Others welcome the hedonistic relativism and rampant consumerism filling the void. Old certainties have passed. The pace of change is accelerating, and individuals and institutions are struggling. I'm speaking, of course, of life in the Roman Empire late in the 3rd century AD. But there just might be some similarities with our situation today. In this series, I've taken up the question of Bruce Wilson's 1983 book, Can God Survive in Australia? And his conclusion that Australia was entering a post-Christian age that neglects or even scorns its rich Christian heritage. I've argued that there have been 3 rival religiosities in Australia: pre-Christian, Christian and post-Christian, long coexisting, whether as strangers, rivals, or even allies, each influencing our society. I've concluded that describing Australia as simply secular, or Christian, or pagan, is to misread our past, present, and future. At the recent ad limina visit of the Australian bishops to Rome, I raised with the Holy Father the particular challenge of the rise of the nuns. He turned, puzzled, to his translator, until I explained that I didn't mean N-U-N-S, whose rise I would celebrate, but N-O-N-E-S, those who say none if asked their religion. We then discussed how the Church in Australia might respond to disaffiliation as well as to a hostile secularising culture. In my first lecture in this series, I took my own look at the post-Christian strand in our culture, its particular Aussie variant, its unholy recent alliance with sectarianism, and its current ascendancy. I also raised some serious questions about any easy reading of Australians as post-Christian, and about the secular inevitability thesis that religion declines as individuals and communities modernise. In my subsequent lecture, I considered the Christian strand in Australian culture. With Reg from the PLFJ in Monty Python's Life of Brian, I asked what the Romans, or in this case the Roman Catholics, have ever done for us. I imagined Reg answering, all right, but apart from the sanity that sanctity brings to a world of sin, or the invention of hospitals, clinics and leprosaria, or the provision of comprehensive primary, secondary and tertiary education, or the orphanages, aged care and welfare, or the many supports for marriage, family and local neighbourhood, or the ending of human sacrifice, cannibalism, slavery, infanticide and the chattel conception of women and children, or the vision of the human person and sublime moral code that inspire so many, or the promotion of literacy and printing, or the advent of the scientific method and much subsequent science, medicine and technology, or the heritage of Christian art, music, literature and architecture, or the corpus of Western theological and philosophical thought that grounds our politics and much else. Apart from all that, what have the Romans, the Roman Catholics, ever done for us? I then considered 3 arenas of continuing Christian influence in court, conversation and culture, and some other ways that Christianity still contributes to liberal modernity. But I also identified the religious blind spots in contemporary culture. If secularisation is not inevitable, Christian survival in Australia is not either. Which leads me to ask, if Australia is not yet a post-Christian society, nor straightforwardly a Christian one, are we more like those 3rd century Romans living in a pre-Christian or pagan society? 2, pre-Christian religion in Australia. When Australians talk of pre-Christian religion, they may think of Aboriginal spirituality or Nimban New Agery. But there's a world of difference between those two, as there is with the ancient religions of the East. Many pre-Christian religions were polytheistic or animistic in nature, with various gods, demigods and ancestors, and with sacred places, festivals, sacrifices and omens, but often without authoritative texts or creeds. But when we talk of postmodern or neo-pagans, we're referring to some who've never really connected with Christianity and to others who were perhaps a little connected but have since disaffiliated from it and now draw upon other religious traditions instead of or as well as Christianity. I remember a man in Chennai, in India, showing me a shrine with many gods. He's very proud of it, and explaining enthusiastically to me, look, there, elephant god, Ranesh, there, Jesus god. They're all in there together. And he thought, isn't that a jolly good thing? Some mix their own spiritual cocktails. Stephen Smith, in Pagans and Christians in the City, argues that many people have concocted a spirituality of belief in a god or gods within nature or themselves, of doctrinal agnosticism and moral relativism, and of spiritual practices that promise health or peace of mind. Amongst the parallels between the late Roman world and contemporary Australia, I'd like to explore tonight these: private gods, prosperity gods, power gods, pleasure gods, and passing away gods. So 3, private gods. In most pre-Christian societies, people shared religious beliefs and moral values, and these shaped individual identity and served as a social glue. In late antiquity, however, the sheer number of gods adopted by the Romans meant different families prayed to different gods, and even within one family, people might pray and make sacrifice to their own private gods. Whatever the external pressures, Roman society was disintegrating, with a fall away from traditional beliefs and practices, decline of major institutions, a growing divorce rate and falling birth rate, and a focus more and more on the self. In the second volume of his seminal work, Democracy in America, the French historian and political writer Alexis de Tocqueville coined the term individualism. By this he meant, I'm quoting him now, a calm and considered feeling which disposes each citizen to isolate himself from the mass of his fellows and withdraw into the circle of family and friends. With this little society formed to his taste, he gladly leaves the greater society to look after itself. Tocqueville both admired and critiqued the individualism of Americans. It went to the heart of their enterprise and achievements, their democratic experiment, and their resilience through various challenges. But it threatened their ability to hold together as communities and as a nation, and to maintain the beliefs that underpinned those very experiments and achievements. Tocqueville's conception of individualism retained a sense of community, but reduced in scale and formed to taste. This last aspect of individualism survived as its defining characteristic in what Australian sociologist Anthony Elliott and American sociologist Charles Lambert have called the new individualism, or what philosopher Charles Taylor called post-liberal atomism. There are upsides and downsides to me-generation atomism. The freedom to be who we want to be, less intrusion by others, less control by family, culture or tradition, a sense of responsibility for our own fate. But there's damage also. Many families fall apart. Individuals too. Young people lack direction. The old and weak are often abandoned. Drugs, depression, self-harm escalate. The culture of the self hasn't always delivered the happiness it promised. In this new individualism, the sense of community is waning. Instead of seeking some ideal of authenticity and distinctiveness amidst a circle of family and friends, people engage, or not, in a series of relationships chosen, renegotiated, or abandoned for the satisfaction they deliver the agent. In Bowling Alone, Robert Putnam observed that while more people are bowling these days, they are often bowling alone. Churches, political parties, sporting clubs, service clubs, Freemasons, lifesavers, you name it, all are struggling with membership and practice. Critics of late liberalism have argued that the atomistic construction of the human person is to be faulted on many levels and is unsustainable. The lack of enduring attachments and received practices undermines identity and commitments, virtue and civic orientation. So too the rise in isolation and loneliness, narcissistic personalities, and broken marriages and families, with all the attendant personal and social costs of each. Worshipping private gods or oneself does not bring the fulfilment and transcendence we crave. There remains a nagging hunger for community, tradition, common identity, a transcendent meta-narrative. So what comes after individualism? Well, let's park that question for the moment as we consider another aspect of Roman and contemporary paganism. 4. Prosperity gods. In the Roman world, there were gods to ensure prosperity and comfort. Abundantia for plenty, Dispata for wealth, Felicitas for luck, Ceres, Fecunditas, Saturn and others for the harvest. While earlier Romans might have admired a certain asceticism and been willing to sacrifice a great deal for the sake of the gods, honour or the republic, by late antiquity they were much more focused on personal wealth and comfort. Without indulging in caricatures of the Romans as small-e Epicureans, the fortunes spent on luxuries by the upper classes and public entertainments for the masses would make even today's Fortune 500 CEOs blush. When Gordon Gekko declared in the 1987 movie Wall Street that greed is good, he spoke for a similar set of values. Neither Christian nor Enlightenment in origin but rather more like the values of late Rome. No more was virtue to be found in discipline and self-sacrifice, in lifelong commitments and cultivating character. Now each person was their own project, choosing their own version of the good life, picking and revising short-term values and loyalties, walking over others to get what they wanted. Like Pontius Pilate on the first Good Friday, hearing Jesus say that those on the side of truth listen to my voice, the culture responds, "Truth? What's that?" And like Mandy in the life of Brian, telling the three wise men who visit her before finding the true Madonna, our culture says, "Give us the gold. Forget the incense for worship and the myrrh of sacrifice." There were, of course, some pluses to the me generation consumerism. Greater affluence, comfort, and opportunity, at least for some. The chance to be different, to choose according to personality and life plans. New technologies with new possibilities. Greater freedom to invest ourselves and our wealth where we like. But there were minuses also. The consumerism of the comfortably off rubs salt into the wound of those barely subsisting. Even the well-off may find that owning lots and having the latest only leaves them craving more. Meanwhile, the natural and human worlds are devoured by the insatiable beast of the market. Worshipping golden calves does not give our lives a sense of purpose. Consumer culture doesn't deliver real happiness. As critics of materialism, such as the recent popes, have demonstrated in various ways, the construction of the person as consumer, like the person as atom, is untenable. The loss of habits of postponed gratification, of investing in the happiness of others, and of valuing things that have little or no market value, has undermined personal happiness and community progress. Worshipping prosperity gods has only left people starving for higher things, for things to value that are not measurable, marketable, controllable, for a sense of self that is rooted in who we are and can become, not just on what we have. So what comes after consumerism? Again, we'll return to this. 5. Power gods. In the pre-Christian world, the gods exercised power arbitrarily and from them devotees hoped to gain power themselves. The Romans turned to Hercules, Mars, Mithras, Quirinus, and Virtus for military might, and to Jupiter, Roma, and Securitas for political influence. All religion was, in a sense, civic religion, and people were obedient to the authorities as sacral figures, even demigods. There were few effective restraints on political power. Those with authority could interfere with almost any area of life and were only constrained by limited resources or their own lifespan, which could be short if they got enemies. Laws were obeyed or else punishments followed. Even the Pax Romana was enforced by brute force. Democratic modernity promised a participatory politics, high ideals of reverence for persons, rights and the rule of law, decisions made only after robust debate and careful deliberation, a focus on the common good by those with power. Most problems are thought to be fixable with enough political will, sound regulation, and government grants. In local communities and even households, Negotiation and control are key. Well, there were boons to the politicism of modernity. Good government could correct for self-interest and tribalism, bring a degree of planning and regulatory consistency in place of the arbitrariness of powerful individuals or the free market, lend resources to the big things that need to be done, and defend people from tyrannies abroad or would-be tyrants at home. Democracy allowed those affected to have their say in how they are governed. But there were hazards in relying upon the political gods to fix all for us. Many problems are beyond a government fix. And even within their proper bounds, governments are far from infallible. Today we see a deep cynicism about politics amongst ordinary citizens across the West, with symptoms including disengagement from political news, fast turnover of leaders, election of populist outsiders. Worshipping gods of power has not delivered the sense of purpose or security that was promised. As the critics of contemporary politics have identified, the decline of habits of civil discourse and debate, of other civic virtues and respect, of the sense of responsibility in public service, and of the quality of leadership have been damaging to our polity and its citizens. We might think of the cynical way in which abortion legislation was introduced into our state parliament recently without prior warning, let alone serious public consultation, and with the initial intention of ramming it through in a few days. In the event, the time taken has been extended somewhat, but the Assembly allowed no serious amendments to this extreme legislation. We'll see if the upper house does better. But the process has demonstrated little respect for women and babies, or for citizens and representatives. It is the raw exercise of political power by an ideological elite, and a good example of why many people are cynical about politics today. Worshipping power gods disempowers the worshipper and leaves them yearning for a civil and world order that respects life and love, that has a vision for human flourishing and the common good, and that is about more than chasing opinion polls and manipulating electorates. So what comes after politics? 6. Pleasure gods. The Romans had many gods ready to indulge their baser lusts, such as Bacchus, Cupid, Liber, Priapus, Venus, and Voluptus. Though not without shame or censure, they were famously licentious, especially in the courts, whether imperial or heavenly. Prostitution, sexual exploitation of slaves, and pornography were widespread. Various substances and spells used to improve erotic lives, and pederasty not uncommon. St. Peter was probably only exaggerating a little when he described Roman life as rather like university life in my day. Debauchery, lust, drunkenness, orgies, carousing, detestable idolatry, and reckless, wild living, to quote the saint. While domestic life was highly praised by the Romans, by late antiquity it was in decline and people looked elsewhere for satisfaction. It'd be easy to rehearse how modernity has separated sex from love, love from marital commitment, marriage from family. No one would pretend this age is successful at moderating desire. Ours is a highly sexualised culture. Addiction to internet porn is epidemic. Many people have multiple sexual partners over a lifetime. Nor is this age famous for its asceticism. Food porn is big on TV these days. Obesity, a major problem. And alcohol, ice, and other substances wreak their havoc. Of course, abandoning some of the wowserism of former times and being open to and about sensual pleasure have their benefits in modernity. Yet few serious commentators still regard the sexual revolution and decline in temperance as unadulterated benefits. Worshipping gods of pleasure like gods of power has not proven to be the way to happiness. Instead, appeasing desire requires more and more extreme pleasures, and agents are left frustrated even when sated. So what comes after pleasure? 7. Passing away gods. In the pre-Christian world, the gods exercised arbitrary power over life and death. But sometimes you could deal with them. A few might help with lifespan and health, Asclepius, Cana, Phoebus, or Salus. But far more gods brought death, such as Dea Tacita, Libitina, Mantus, Mors and Morta, Pluto, Prosperina, Viduus, and the Inferi. Whether in the pantheon or on earth, it was a violent world. Assassinations and executions were common, and the death of slaves and gladiators a public entertainment. Women and children were considered chattels in the late 3rd century AD, and it was the father's right, a right frequently exercised, to have his baby killed before or after birth. In the 21st century, it's the mother's right rather than the father's, but equally common. The New South Wales Legislative Assembly wants abortion up to 22 weeks, no questions asked, and right up to birth if 2 doctors agree. Late abortions, sex selection abortions, genetic abortions, it's all good. All doctors will be conscripted into the abortion industry, either as providers or as advertisers. There will be no additional support for pregnant women. The only option is abortion. And I guess the next piece of pagan death legislation for this state will be a euthanasia bill, Victorian style. Well, some would praise this trend of modernity to take back the reins over life and death that were in the hands of pre-Hippocratic doctors and pre-Christian citizens. But in an increasingly violent world where millions of unborn babies and increasing numbers of newborn, disabled and elderly people die each year at the hands of so-called health professionals, in which wars and violent crime fill the 6 o'clock news, in which domestic violence and abuse are all too common, and in which the culture of indignation manufactures outraged trolls and angry mobs at the flick of a keyboard. Many crave a gentler temper, such as that of the Good Samaritan or the Christ who commanded the scabbarding of swords. Worshipping death gods increases violence and leaves everyone feeling insecure. So what comes after death? 8. After the pagan gods comes Christianity. The year after Diocletian became emperor, a rich young man named Antony decided to sell all he owned and retire to the desert, where there grew around him a group of followers, the first desert fathers. Antony of Egypt heralded the beginning of an age of Christian asceticism and ultimately of Christian monasticism. Meanwhile, Cyprian of Carthage, Athanasius of Alexandria, Hilary of Poitiers, and the Cappadocian Fathers were laying down the intellectual foundations for a Christian civilization. At the very time that the Roman Empire was mired in the worship of self, prosperity, power, pleasure, and death, and Diocletian determined to exterminate the Christian alternative, the seeds of victory for the Nazarenes were being sown. The Diocletian persecution was the worst Christians had faced. Yet only 30 years later, Christianity was sanctioned by the Emperor Constantine himself. But if the Church is to do great things for humanity again, it must recover its voice. Before it can do that, it must continue to face head-on the terrible child sexual abuse crisis, with all its harms to victims and families, undermining self-confidence inside and credibility outside the Church, and leaving in its wake anger and cynicism amongst many of the faithful, clergy, even bishops. As we keep processing this and responding appropriately, we must also work through our personal feelings as followers of Christ and find a spiritual wisdom about this present chastisement of the Church. Holiness, our faith teaches, can come through purgation, humility through humiliation, fidelity through holding on faithfully through persecution, resurrection after passion. Bringing our church and community through all this requires patience and hope. First and foremost, we must show by our actions that we really are Christians, followers of eternal truth, goodness, and love. As St. Peter wrote to the persecuted church, "Dear friends, I urge you, live such good lives among the pagans that though they accuse you of wrongdoing, they may see your good deeds and glorify God for them." Pope St. Paul VI likewise said, "Modern man listens more willingly to witnesses than to teachers, and if he does listen to teachers, it's only because they are authentic witnesses. It is therefore primarily by her conduct and life that the Church will evangelise the world. In other words, by her living witness of fidelity to the Lord Jesus, the witness of poverty and detachment, of freedom in the face of the powers of this world, in short, the witness of sanctity." What we need, therefore, are new Antonys, Athanasiuses, Helenas, and Constantines, men and women, pastors and laity, in the world and for the world, demonstrating the reality of Christianity in admirable lives fragrant with the allure of Christ. Only then will people listen to the wisdom we might have to offer or want to join us in worship and action. 9. I'm nearly there. Pre-Christian Australia. From the beginning, the ordinary pattern for the Church has been painful purification followed by enthusiastic renewal. On the Easter day, when the disciples hid in a locked room from the authorities determined to wipe them out, who would have dreamed they'd become the most effective evangelists the world had ever known? At the end of the 3rd century, when the Diocletian persecution threatened the extinction of Christianity, none could have guessed that the monastic movement, patristic theology, and the freedom of the Church were just around the corner. At the end of the first millennium, amidst appalling corruption of church leaders and the re-emergence of dark dualist heresies, who would have imagined the medieval flowering ahead, promoted by the Friars movement, with their universities, scholastic theology, and great preacher saints. In the depths of the Reformation, when Christianity was torn asunder and in danger of being overrun by the Moors, few appreciated what a spiritual renaissance was afoot, progressed by new religious movements such as the Jesuits, a new Christian humanism, an effective defence against the Ottomans, an extraordinary mission to the New World, and again, many new saints. Or when the Enlightenment's reign of terror, Napoleonic violence, and totalising ideologies threatened to de-Christianise the West. Who knew that the great 19th century missionary and teaching orders were about to blossom, evangelising the Pacific, establishing schools and hospitals all over Australia and beyond, producing yet another crop of saints? So too, we must hope that after the darkness of recent times for the Church, new religious movements will thrive, new evangelical energies be released, new missions be embraced, new saints emerge. That will be far more important than new models of governance or endless debates over neuralgic issues over which the Church in Australia has no authority. In some of my examples from history, Christianity was renewing itself in a world that was already Christian, or at least should have been, but where its survival was in doubt. In other cases, the post-resurrection church, the Diocletian church, the church contending with the Ottoman Empire, or in the new worlds of the Americas and Pacific, the context was a pre-Christian one. As I've argued in this series, pre-Christian, Christian, and post-Christian religiosities sometimes compete, sometimes coexist, sometimes even cooperate in Australian history, and we can expect more in the years to come. In the dimensions that I've identified Australia as pre-Christian, there are opportunities for conversation, collaboration, and conversion. In some ways, pre-Christian religion is much easier for Christianity to handle than post-Christian. It has a strong sense of the sacred and of the need for assistance from that realm. That's an entry point for Christianity. Post-Christian secularism, on the other hand, may have other entry points, such as its reverence for human reason, persons, dignity and rights, but it forecloses on the transcendent. Where paganism believed religion to be a crucial element for society, secularism, for all its putative open-mindedness, is less and less tolerant of any religion. The renewal of our church in places like Australia will come through embracing the challenge to evangelise the not yet Christians and re-evangelise the should-be Christians, using new energies, rhetoric, methods, and always ensuring that the witness we give matches the rhetoric. My conclusion, number 10. For many reasons I've articulated through these 3 lectures, I conclude that the dire predictions about the death of God are false. Ours may well be a Christian future after all. As sociologist Dean Hogue and others have argued, many who have gone cold on religion have not found anything better. Rather than being true post-Christians or nuns, they profess a kind of Christianity light, perhaps alloyed with bits of pre-Christian and secular thinking. They can be catalysed in various ways to recover their enthusiasm for a more full-cream Catholicism. Evangelising pre-Christian Australia, damp-proofing ourselves against post-Christian Australia, and renewing Christian Australia will require a better informed, more intelligent faith, more effective telling of the Christian story through preaching, teaching, and media, old and new, the recovery of a deeply affective liturgical devotional life, the cultivation of more virtuous and saintly character, the witness of lives of justice and compassion, and the renewal of supportive communities of family, parish, school, movement, and polity. The project of re-sacralising secularised cultures, institutions, and individuals is an exciting one. After the 3rd century crisis under Diocletian, Christianity went from being the most persecuted religion in the empire to being the most practiced within a generation, counting even the emperor as a convert. He had a good mum. As the European civil order disintegrated, the Church provided moral, social, and spiritual stability for the next millennium. My thought tonight is that 21st century Australia is not so different. We too are sent to a tumultuous world as witnesses. We go relatively powerless, humbled by recent humiliations, respected only to the extent that we demonstrate the authenticity of our faith, hope, and love. It's an adventure as exciting as any experienced by our ancestors, bringing good news to the poor, liberty to captives, sight to the blind. Instead of wishing we were in some other time, or closing our eyes to present challenges, we say, thanks be to God for giving us this time and place to bring forth new fruit. God bless you.
And I'd now like to invite Greg Sheridan AO to deliver the response to tonight's lecture. Greg.
Well, Your Grace, Reverend Bishops, ladies and gentlemen, friends all, thank you so much for the honour of responding to that magnificent series of addresses by His Grace. You have to say, both the Archbishop and God himself are pretty broad-minded to allow, much less to invite, a journalist to come and talk about God in the Cathedral House of St Mary's Cathedral in the presence of bishops and scholars and people who know a great deal more about the subject than the journalist. However, we are a courageous profession, we journalists. Not knowing anything has never been a bar to us holding a strong opinion and expressing it. Now, I do want to respond very specifically to some of the key insights that the Archbishop has given us over this series, but I also want to just make one other little personal remark which bears on the joint experience which you and I are having tonight. And that is, you know, I've just written this book called God is Good for You, and I tried, although, you know, it's not a secret to most people that I'm a Catholic, I tried to take a non-denominational approach and look for that mere Christianity consensus that C.S. Lewis talked about, so that, you know, rather than the Irish disease of agreeing on 99% of something with our friends and fighting to the death over the 1%, we could all sort of come together. But there were bits of Catholic doctrine that I just couldn't sort of let go or not, you know, fail to mention. My favourite one is the doctrine of purgatory, because if you are a journalist aiming for heaven, it's a pretty unlikely proposition. And purgatory is a joy. Purgatory turns a half-Senate election where you are representing a minor party and have doubts over your citizenship and have almost no chance of getting a quota into a double dissolution, where if the preferences flow just right and the wind is blowing in the right direction and everything, you might scrape into the last possible place. So I cling to the doctrine of purgatory. No one will take purgatory away from me. And you know, the church's ambition is to get the maximum number of people into purgatory. And I hope one day to see all my friends there. But the reason I bring it up with you tonight is to think that for the next 15 minutes or so, think of the time off you'll earn in purgatory for being here and enduring this mini address. Now, the Archbishop's series of lectures are really a wonderful intellectual tour de force, and they're too rich to respond to, you know, in full justice. They reminded me thematically of the haunting question that Philip Larkin asked: what remains when disbelief is gone? And it's a challenging question. I quoted this remark in my book, and the publishers said, no, obviously you meant what remains when belief is gone. And I said, no, he's saying what remains when disbelief is gone, because disbelief is dependent on belief. And when you reach such a level of post-Christianity that you're really pre-Christianity, all the memory of belief is gone, so all the definition of disbelief as against belief is gone, and there is a terrible existential crisis. At least I think that was the implication that Philip Larkin was driving at, and in a sense, that's the theme that the Archbishop was addressing eloquently through these 3 lectures. Now, some conservatives, and you know, I'd call myself a moderate conservative, but some conservatives believe that we can enjoy the benefits of the traditions of Christianity without having Christian belief. So this would be a position, say, of a good person like Douglas Murray in his splendid book, The Strange Death of Europe. He's saying Europe is dying because it has no animating belief any longer, and the only belief it ever had, which ever animated it really across its whole civilization, was Christianity. Therefore, it would be good if it readopted Christianity. But by the way, he says, and he's a good person, I'm not criticising him personally, I'm trying to elucidate his position. Therefore, he says, we should re-embrace Christianity. However, he says, I of course don't believe Christianity is true. Now, that strikes me as the sort of problematic or equivocal or contradictory position which a certain sort of conservative of a certain age can embrace. You can say to yourself, society has lived well with these traditions, they've served society well, I've lived a life in the presence and benefiting from the wisdom of these traditions. It would be a good thing for society to continue to do so. But imagine trying to sell that message to an idealistic 18-year-old to say, what I want you to do is commit your life, all your energy, all your idealism, your passion, your creativity, your genius, your desire for justice to a set of values which are based on superstition and lies and have no meaning. That's not really a very winnable proposition. So as a foreign editor, I've come to the slightly disconcerting conclusion that the West cannot continue as the West, cannot survive in any meaningful way as the West without re-engaging a belief in Christianity. Now, of course, this is a foreign editor's concern, not an archbishop's concern. The archbishop is not concerned with the West, he's concerned with human souls. And of course, Christianity is a universal religion, and the majority of Christians today, as it happens, are not Westerners. But we live in a Western society, and so it's relevant to us. And it is the case that Western civilization was formed entirely out of the Jewish and Christian traditions, which I think it's quite reasonable to call a Judeo-Christian tradition. And I don't think the West can survive without a re-energised recommitment to Christianity. There are large parts of the world now, very dynamic movements in the world, Chinese nationalism, Russian nationalism, Islamism of all kinds, which don't think the West any longer has anything to say. Not that they've come to hate the West particularly, they just don't think it has anything to say. It's has nothing interesting to say. Really, it has nothing at all to say. It's a bit difficult when you go into a Chinese or Indian community and say, now I want to subject your 6-year-old to gender fluidity education. They look at you as if you're a bit crazy. But try selling that proposition in Jakarta or Bangkok or anywhere in the world as a core element of Western civilization. They just think the West has gone crazy. And broadly speaking, they're right. The West has gone crazy. These are things, of course, which an irresponsible journalist can say, which an archbishop would sensibly never say. But it's very important when you're a journalist to exploit to the full the inherent irresponsibility of your position. I think the Archbishop's formulation of pre-Christian, Christian and post-Christian is very acute and telling and very helpful. It is a change from the old formulation about Australian culture that there are 2 religions in Australia, Catholicism and anti-Catholicism. I think that is no longer entirely accurate, partly because I think the culture is as hostile to other believing Christians now as it is to Catholicism. Anti-Catholicism used to be the anti-Semitism of the intellectual. Now all Christians are subject, I think, more or less to the same hostility. It strikes me that the 3 strands that the Archbishop speaks of, it's a wonderful formulation, a very useful formulation, very rich. Are they 3 competitive species locked in a moment of evolutionary contest in which they will eat each other's food supply or indeed eat each other, and one or other will become the dominant species and the rest will die out, as we've seen so often in evolutionary history? Or alternatively, are they 3 parts of the one person? There is overwhelming sociological evidence that young people now are suffering a crisis of faith which is related to a crisis of knowledge. Faith is not the same thing as knowledge. We know that belief is more an act of the will than the intellect. Nonetheless, you can't really believe something which you regard as unreasonable, and you can't really believe something which you don't know. And there is overwhelming sociological evidence that throughout the West, by which I mean Western Europe, North America and Australia and New Zealand, young people don't know what the content of their church belief is. And this is across the denominations. Of course, there's a fantastic, bold and strong minority of young people who do know and who do believe. But the mass of young people astonishingly don't know. So in a way, they are pre-Christian. And yet, at the same time, they do know that their grandparents were Christian. And so they might think that Christianity is kind of old hat. Been there, done that. We've seen it at the movies. The pro-Christian movies are old black and white things, you know, Spencer Tracy in Boys Town. We don't like that. That's very dull now. And so they're also post-Christian because they have a bit of a chip on their shoulder about Christianity. And yet at the same time, like the character Pinky in Graham Greene's Brighton Rock, in their worst moments, they feel a moment of nostalgia for a moral life. They feel a moment of longing for something which they don't understand, but which they vaguely know exists out there. And so, in some sense, they are Christian as well. So as well as 3 strands in a culture, I think this formulation can describe 3 strands in a single person. Another way of considering the Archbishop's entire new hermeneutic is that he is suggesting that there is now, and is certainly coming, a crisis in secularism. So there might have been a crisis of belief, now there is a crisis in disbelief, a crisis in secularism. Crisis, of course, means danger and opportunity. I spend a lot of time with military folks, and I like them very much, and I enjoy their company very much. And I'm afraid my writing is infused with their metaphors, and sometimes this annoys my Christian friends. But on the other hand, you can't please everybody, especially with your metaphors. But a moment of crisis for secularism means, as my Air Force friends would say, that you're operating in a target-rich environment. There are plenty of things to shoot at. And the other seed of wisdom which I'd take from the military for our current circumstance is the general who prevails is generally the general who has what the military calls situational awareness. That's a term of art in military life, and it means the ability to take on board and integrate and make effective use of a wide range of information coming from very many different sources and use it in a timely way in the battle space to get the information right now when you need it and to turn that information into effective action. Now, I think the Archbishop's really splendid formulation offers us both a great analytical prism to understand the present moment, and it offers us a way forward, even if it avoids the kind of militant and militaristic and inherently violent metaphors to which I am naturally prone as a journalist. In this moment, however, I think the Archbishop is absolutely right to say neither the survival of Christianity nor the death of Christianity in Australia is inevitable. It's, I think, really a point of Christian doctrine that nothing is inevitable. That's the very nature of free will. Nothing is inevitable. But in this moment that we are presented with, this moment of crisis in secularism, I do believe the Archbishop is right to identify that moment as one which presents tremendous opportunities to a lively, committed Christian community. But to take that opportunity, we need several things. We need the situational awareness. We need the courage to proclaim the truth. Now, many things have, done damage to the church in recent years, and the child abuse scandal is one of the most terrible, obviously. But in its way, that is still a call to courage, because that crisis doesn't exempt you from the obligation to continue to proclaim the truth. And of course, proclaiming the truth doesn't mean that you're setting yourself up as a moral exemplar. I mean, otherwise, no journalist would ever write a book about Christianity, for goodness sake. Indeed, the whole business of coming out as a Christian involves facing up to your own moral infirmity and saying, well, wouldn't it be terrible if anybody judged the church or Christianity or the Christian message by my life? But on the other hand, if you leave the defence of Christianity entirely to the morally qualified, it's going to be a pretty small platoon. Perhaps the people in this chapter house and nobody else. And so everybody has to join in the battle, even the morally unqualified. And we need, all of us, a plan of action and a willingness to own up to our beliefs at all stages. The Archbishop rightly calls on us all to lead lives which are Christian lives. That's absolutely right. But it also requires a great deal of courage in the current circumstance to go on and proclaim the truth. Far be it from me, as a kind of amateur Christian and just a denizen of Grub Street to quote scripture, but somewhere in the gospel it says something like, not the culture will be moderately unsympathetic and you'll find that you don't get the run on the ABC that you should. It says something like, the world will despise you for my name's sake. Really, although Christians get a hard time in contemporary Western culture, we're not persecuted here in the way Christians are in many parts of the world. Outside of the West, Christianity is on fire. In Africa, in Latin America, in China. It's the only force in China which the Chinese Communist Party cannot control. The only nationwide social force which the Communist Party cannot control, which is why the Communist Party in China is terrified of Christianity. Not because it has a program which is against the government, but because it simply cannot be controlled. But all over the world, well, not all over the world, but in many parts of the world, from Pakistan to Africa to the Middle East, Christians are being persecuted and killed for their faith, and they believe so seriously that they will accept death before disavowal. So the slings and arrows that most of us are subject to in Australia, in comparison with that, are pretty moderate after all. So there's really no excuse for being quiet. You have to, there's a wonderful American movie called The Molly Maguires about a group of revolutionary Irish coal miners in Pennsylvania. Why would you be revolutionary if you're a coal miner in Pennsylvania? Because you're an Irishman, I suppose. And there's a great line in it where Sean Connery, the heroic Irish rebel, says to Richard Harris, the evil agent of the American coal mine owners, he says, I saw my father in these coal mines all these years and I thought he had all that gunpowder and he never caused an explosion. He said, I'm determined to use my gunpowder. And of course, my heart warmed for Sean Connery when I saw him say that. Because that's what we all have a certain amount of gunpowder in our lives, and we're all obliged to use it. Of course, these metaphors, which I love, of how much more fun it is to be the guerrilla force rather than the government. We don't control the towns and the villages and the bridges anymore. We just want to blow them up and so forth. That's a very limited, specific kind of metaphor, just to say that we have to understand that, in a sense, we now are in a minority position. And so we don't have to defend the status quo. We simply have to advance the truth, which we believe in. And if we are asking for minority rights, we're asking for minority rights for the truth. And you hope that the truth ultimately wins lots of adherents, because the truth, after all, resides also in the inner nature of every human being. So there is much in every human being which will respond to the truth. That's why it doesn't matter if the odds are against us. But I do want to thank the Archbishop for giving us a magnificent reflection on the circumstances that we find ourselves in, and a magnificent way forward. On one occasion I interviewed the Archbishop and I was taxing him with the relative weakness of the Church, and he made the point to me that the Church and the faith and Christianity have been weak before, but they're always strong on the rebound, which is a point he made much more eloquently than I can make it tonight. And which leads me to the final reflection, someone much cleverer than I. We can be full of confidence. It doesn't matter where we are. At the moment, we can be full of confidence because we follow a God who knows his way out of the grave. Thank you.